let's start with our very first Fireside chat. Please welcome Anthony from the Daily Gwei on stage.
Hello. Yeah, testing. It's working.
GM. Oh, I hate saying that, actually. So, our chat is intentionally scheduled to be the first one because as we were kind of planning about what we should talk about, we realized that there's so many things that are in our heads that we kind of just know are happening because we've been in this space too long or we're just way too deep. But not everybody may know all these things that are happening. So we decided to make this a live recording of the Daily Gwei. And we'll just cover what's happening in the news, and we'll kind of just list everything that's going in our heads, so we'll be jumping around a lot of topics. But the goal here is to help all of you just flag a bunch of important themes that are going on, and for whatever topics you're interested in, you get to kind of deep dive in on your own, and we'll kind of cover some of these specifics, but mostly keep things high level on just listing things as much as possible. And I think the most interesting thing and the most recurring theme in our space has just been largely scaling. There's so much going on with scaling. We've talked about how do we get more transactions per second, how do we get gas prices low. All that stuff has just been literally the only thing anybody has cared about in the Ethereum ecosystem for the last 5 years. And to me, I feel like we've made a lot of progress. So my kind of first question to you would be, do you agree with that? And how do you think about what's happened in the world of L2s and scaling?
Yeah, so I would say that I completely agree with that. And I've been calling the period since Dencun went live with blobs, or EIP 4844, as people will know it, as the golden age of Ethereum scaling. For so many years, we had all these promises, we had all this research, had all this kind of insider development on the layer 2s, and we were making grand promises about how they'd be much cheaper than mainnet, they'd be faster. But for a period of time, they were live, but they weren't very cheap. And then suddenly with Dencun going live, they got a lot cheaper. And I think the reduction in fees actually surprised the people working on the EIP 4844 or blobs with how cheap things actually got. And now the bottleneck in scaling has actually moved onto the layer 2s themselves. And so they're doing a lot of work. You have Jesse Pollak from Base talking about how they're going to be scaling Base up to 1 gigagas per second, if you've seen him talking about that on Twitter, because now the layer 1 is no longer the bottleneck for these layer 2s. So they've dropped the fees down, but now the fees can go up based on the layer 2's own limitations. But the reason why I call it the golden age of Ethereum scalability generally is because from that point, from Dencun, over the next few years, we're going to be seeing a lot more scaling be done at the layer 2 side, but also upgrades coming to the layer 1 to further help the layer 2's scale as well. So yeah, I mean, if anyone has been paying attention in the last few years, as I said, there's been a bit of kind of back and forth about just how scalable these things are. Well, now we see they can be very scalable, but it's just required us to put the work in, put the upgrades live on mainnet, and then for the teams to actually use them and for the users to get the benefit as well.
So I guess the thing that maybe most people will immediately ask is, okay, we solved L1 scaling by introducing a lot of these layer 2s, but then now the layer 2s are jammed and we gotta now do scalings on them, and then we're getting to layer 3s. Is this like a turtles all the way down situation? We keep adding a new layer and then scaling and hitting limits? Or do you think this is still a net progress and we just have to kind of understand why these bottlenecks exist? Why should people still be excited about more layer 2s going on in this space?
I liken it to how the kind of normal web or the normal internet developed, where there was a period of time where there was this kind of notion early on, basically maybe in the 70s and 80s, where how much demand could there really be was the question back then. It's oh, we'll just do everything on one server, it'll be fine, we'll have mainframes, IBM was famous for this. But then as the demand grew and grew and grew, it blew everyone's expectations out of the water. And they're like, okay, well, how do we scale this thing? And the concept of modularity was introduced, where we started scaling via different means, scaling via adding more servers, not just having one server. Everyone has their own personal computer where they could run the compute on. They wouldn't have to just run it on a mainframe somewhere else, right? So that was really obviously a huge unlock, and that's allowed us to scale up the internet, scale up the web. And I think the same thing is happening within the crypto space right now. So as you mentioned, they're always kind of talk about, do we need layer 3s now? Do we need layer 4s? So on and so forth. But I think each kind of part of that stack, of that modularity stack, serves its own purpose for a certain set of users. There's not going to be, hundreds of layer 2s and hundreds of layer 3s that kind of win the most market share. It's going to be a network effect game, like we see in Web 2, where there's only a handful of kind of websites that have the most traffic on them. That's just by nature of the law of network effects. So I think the same thing is going to play out within the crypto space, but I think because the market tends to get ahead of where the technology is, people think that we're a lot further along than where we are, which we're not. We're definitely not. We're still very early in the technology rollout. Right now, none of the layer 2s could handle anywhere near what we would consider mainstream demand, but there is a clear path to getting there, at least from my point of view and from a lot of people in the ecosystem, that we now have a very clear path of how we're going to scale Ethereum. It may not be everyone's cup of tea. Maybe everyone wants to have just like one layer that they do everything on, but within the Ethereum ecosystem, we definitely believe in modularity, and we believe that's the most sustainable way to scale this to the world.
We're definitely going to touch into modularity in a bit, but the most kind of common question here would be, yes, if we kind of look at Web 2 or even any physical goods services, there is a power law that exists. The top 5 or 6 brands or companies are the biggest kind of players in any space, but we're still seeing hundreds of layer 2s, or at least the attempts of them kind of going live. And the thing I'm curious about is understanding if you have a framework for how should people think about different applications choosing to become layer 2. So we're seeing very much application-specific layer 2s, and then some people are saying we're just going to scale up and be in a separate network because we're just getting too much traffic. Do you think they behave as 2 different categories, or is it going to be power laws and application-specific rollups or layer 2s, or is it all like, hey, Base and Optimism and Arbitrum become the big ones, and then they have 90% of all the activity, but everybody else just kind of stays in their small corners, and they're still successful, but just not aiming to get millions of transactions?
So the way I think about it is we currently have a Cambrian explosion happening within the layer 2 space, within the modular space. But just like any other Cambrian explosion, there is an evolution process that takes place. And the weakest, for lack of a better word, solutions will be the ones that kind of die off, and the strongest will survive and go on to scale Ethereum to the world. So if you take that lens and then you look at what's happening today, we already see this, where Optimism has what they call the superchain, where essentially it is the concept that you could build thousands of rollups using the OP stack, and they could all be part of the same layer 2 as part of a superchain. So you could have all of these different rollups, all these hundreds of thousands, but they're still part of the same ecosystem. And for those who maybe aren't aware, Base is part of that superchain. They are building on the OP stack. Same with something like Zora, there's a few other chains out there. And then you even have these L3s that live on Base, like Degen chain, that is using Arbitrum's technology, funny enough, as an L3 on Base. So you can see that modularity playing out there, where you can use different parts of the stack here. But this says nothing about who's going to succeed. Like, I couldn't tell you today, in 5 to 10 years, which L2s are actually going to be the winners.
Same thing for L1s.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I the L1 I can give you an answer, but when it comes to the L2s, it's definitely, anyone's game. And people will look at Base and say, okay, well, they've got Coinbase's support. We're confident Coinbase is going to be around for a while. It's like, yeah, sure, but anything can happen in that. Maybe it becomes too hard for them to continue with Base because of regulations, for example, like or law enforcement or something like that. Like, anything can happen here. So I think the leaders today may not be the leaders of tomorrow, and it doesn't take very long for that to play out either.
Do you think in that world we kind of see that coming, and we sort of already self-select ourselves to like either stop using it or kind of slowly wind down? Because the biggest question that leads to is, well, if we're going to even have 20 chains, which is not crazy to assume, that's still messy. Your assets can only be in one place at a time. You have to still spend anywhere from money to brain power figuring out where things are. And right now, it's a very messy world. How do we think about interoperability in that situation?
Yeah, so there are a few different solutions when it comes to interoperability. I mean, I talked about the superchain. They have their own solution where essentially if you're part of the superchain, you're interoperable with all the other chains that are part of it, part of the superchain here. But there is also a lot of ongoing research, very early research, but very promising research about things like shared sequencing, something called based sequencing, and there's Polygon is building something called the AggLayer, which is aiming to have all the assets be part of just like this neutral layer, and then you could be interoperable interoperable through that. There are things like intents, which is more in the MEV world, but can be used for interoperability. We already have a lot of bridging protocols live that, you know, they're not perfect, but they do what you need them to do, because with optimistic rollups, for people who don't know, Base is built using optimistic rollup technology, so is the whole superchain ecosystem and Arbitrum. If you wanted to withdraw natively, it would take up to 7 days, or take actually 7 days to withdraw. So obviously that is non-workable for the vast majority of people, so you can use these bridges which have extra risk attached to them, but they do the job. They let you get your funds a lot faster. But the goal is to remove the need for these bridges and remove the need for this added risk and for things to become more interoperable. But generally, when I look at fragmentation, I see it play out everywhere. It's not just with the L2s. Because, for example, if I'm on Ethereum and I want to do something on another L1, I have to bridge to that L1. Like, I am fragmented from that L1. And there are different ways to interoperate between L1s, but the problems there arise from the fact that the L1s have their own security guarantees, have their own, you know, block times, have their own kind of intricacies, which make it very hard to do safe and secure interoperability. Whereas if you're an L2 and you're settling down to Ethereum L1, you're all settling on the same layer, so you all have much easier and much safer interoperability, and based on the solutions that I've just mentioned, but others are also out there and coming online as time goes on. So I do think that while it is an issue today, it will definitely get solved, and it is solved in a much cleaner way in an L2 world, rather than just having like multiple L1s, at least from my perspective.
Oh, definitely. Because the goal here is to tell people about all the things that are happening, let's maybe just do a one-liner on a bunch of things that we just talked about or you just named. So let's look at different ways that people are solving this interoperability. So what is AggLayer, what is shared sequencing, and what is base sequencing?
Yes, I won't go too deep on each of these because they do get pretty deep, but the AggLayer is something that Polygon is building, but they are very clear about the fact that it is not a Polygon product. It is something that they're building for the ecosystem that any layer 2 can tap into and can use. So it's essentially the concept of having all of the assets live on this one, it's technically not a layer, but you know, just for I guess ease of discussing this, have it all exist on the AggLayer, so all of these assets are able to be interoperable with each other, no matter what roll-up or L2 that you're on, as long as they're opted into the AggLayer. So it definitely does need an opt-in here. And what that enables is basically that you won't have to take assets from Arbitrum to Base in order to do something on Base. You'd be able to do something on Base using the assets that you have on the AggLayer, and you're able to use them on Arbitrum as well. So that's, from a high level, what the AggLayer is trying to do. It does get a lot deeper than that, and I encourage people to read about that. But that is basically what it does there. And then shared sequencing and base sequencing definitely fall into each other. They're kind of like, I guess, sister concepts. But essentially, it's the concept of right now, each layer 2 or each rollup has what's called a sequencer, which processes and executes the transactions and orders the transactions. Now, they're all isolated from each other. You know, Base has its own sequencer, Arbitrum has its own sequencer, so on and so forth. So the concept of shared sequencing is, as the name implies, is to share the sequencing between different layers. And that would also enable interoperability between the transactions and those sorts of things there. And base sequencing is the same concept, but instead of using a layer 2 sequencer, you would use the layer 1 to do your sequencing. So for example, Ethereum layer 1 validators would be able to sequence layer 2 transactions, which is probably the newest.
The direction shift where layer 2 transaction sequencing happens now and then it gets settled.
Yes.
But here we're saying let's just make that the first.
Yeah. Let's just not enshrine it, but let's let's make it so that we can use. I mean, the Ethereum validator set and the node operator set is one of, if not the most decentralized in the world. So let's just tap into that. Instead of kind of spinning up all these new things, we can already tap into something that we have, and it also becomes more secure because you're not going from and it becomes more censorship resistant as well because you're not relying on this new kind of network of sequences that you have to bootstrap. You can just use the existing Ethereum ones. And also, just the last comment here on this, EigenLayer plays into this too, where essentially you can build a shared sequencing network as an AVS on EigenLayer in order to essentially bootstrap that. So yeah, again, because everything's modular now, we get to pick and choose what we want to use, and it becomes a really nice solution to all of these issues.
Hopefully that's not too confusing, because it is to me, and I've been in this space a while. Well, speaking of EigenLayer, let's talk about a really interesting topic and a very hot topic in this space, and that's restaking. So let's maybe cover what restaking is in a sentence and what it isn't, which I think is equally important, and maybe go into some of the ways we can think about how this affects everything in our ecosystem?
So I think restaking is one of the most misunderstood primitives within the Ethereum ecosystem today, because of the fact that we had Terra that blew up and everyone likens it to Terra, which is completely wrong. But I will give an explanation about what EigenLayer is first and then dive into what it isn't, as you said. So essentially what it is the concept of, restaking, not just EigenLayer, but restaking generally, is the concept of taking an asset that has already been staked, such as ETH, and then reusing that to do something else, right? To secure an Oracle network, to make a shared sequencer and secure that, to secure layer 2s using that. So essentially you're reusing the economic security, as we call it, of ETH stake for some other purpose. So it's the concept of shared security, as EigenLayer likes to call it. Now, the reason why this is very cool and why people would want to use this is because traditionally spinning up a distributed and decentralized network of nodes is incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult. We've seen this with the different L1s out there. They have a really hard time
setting
doing
up
that.
a miner network or just getting people to run nodes. You can't keep it too decentralized. It ends up being centralized.
Exactly. And Ethereum is unique in that it has, not totally unique. Bitcoin also has this culture, to their credit, of encouraging people at home to run nodes. And not only run nodes, but also stake from home as well. And so because of that, I think EigenLayer saw that and we're like, we have this cool restaking primitive. Let's tap into this and let's get these node operators to secure the AVSs as part of the EigenLayer ecosystem, which has been obviously incredibly successful to this point. They just went live with their AVS system. They've also gone live with their token, which is a bit of drama around, but we won't touch on the token. So there's that. But I do want to talk about the really important point as well of what EigenLayer or what restaking isn't. So restaking isn't leverage. It's not inherently leverage. There is no leverage going on. When you're restaking your ETH, that ETH is backed up by ETH in the deposit contract, we call it, or on the beacon chain. It is staked there. So new ETH isn't being created here. There's no leverage being created here. You're essentially just taking what you already have in an LST or an LRT token. So you have like STETH or RETH or ETHify's version, which is the liquid restaking token. You're taking these and you're doing other kind of other things with them. So essentially, there's no inherent leverage. You can leverage these tokens, of course, but there's no inherent leverage in restaking. It is using the existing ETH.
Compared to like a lending protocol like Maker, where you're actually kind of creating a CDO and depositing and borrowing on behalf of it, which behaves the same way for an outsider, but not the same mechanics.
Yeah, exactly. And I've seen people compare EigenLayer to the 2008 financial crisis, saying, won't this all just blow up? And it's like, yeah, sure, if there's more leverage, but in EigenLayer or restaking generally is not inherently leverage. It's only when people start putting them into lending protocols, so on and so forth, that it becomes that. And just the final thing I want to say here is when people make the comparison to Terra, how Terra blew up was essentially that it had a death spiral. That's completely wrong, because the way the Terra mechanism worked is that in order to essentially make sure that the UST stablecoin didn't depeg or didn't continue to depeg, they would print more Luna tokens. Ethereum is not printing more ETH to save EigenLayer or save restaking or save any protocol. There is no mechanism to do that, and there will never be a mechanism to do that, hopefully. I mean, if there is, you can say goodbye to me. But essentially, that's the main difference there, is that there is no kind of risk there because there isn't that inherent leverage. There isn't that printing of new ETH to cover losses or anything like that. It is one-to-one backed up by ETH, and you can see that on-chain. You don't have to believe me. You go on-chain, you see it all.
It is one-to-one. I think that's the important point.
Yes.
All right, let's switch gears into slightly higher level, but at the same time, lower level on what we're talking about, which is what's happening with the Ethereum protocol itself. A lot of people usually see the outcomes of all the efforts that have gone into scaling years down the road, but these things have been working in the works for years. The merge was a 5-year battle on just getting all those things finally at a point where everybody can mostly stop complaining about transaction fees, mostly. But there's a lot more in the works. So I'm curious about what you think are some interesting things that are in the works right now that will be protocol upgrades in the future that make Ethereum just more powerful.
Yeah, so I kind of bucket the things on the Ethereum roadmap into two different buckets here. There is the user-facing and the non-user-facing. And if anyone has seen Vitalik's Ethereum roadmap, it's a flowchart that he put together with different phases, like the surge, the splurge, the merge, so on and so forth. there are items in there that are both user-facing and non-user-facing. I think when it comes to the Ethereum L1, a lot of it is probably non-user-facing, where it's things like, how do we make sure that MEV doesn't destroy the protocol, or how do we make the, staking mechanism more secure, so on and so forth. So a lot of those upgrades are geared towards making the L1 chain more reliable and more robust, not necessarily more scalable for the end user. But then there are upgrades on there that will make it more scalable for the end user. And as I mentioned before, we had EIP 4844 go live, or blobs, which is part of the wider sharding roadmap of Ethereum. So essentially, it's not the only solution. There are others coming. There is data availability sampling and data availability sharding, and a few others out there that I'm forgetting right now. But those all fall into the same bucket of user-facing. Yeah, MaxEB is a funny one because there are some. Actually, this might be a hybrid between the two buckets that sit in between, where they are more non-user-facing, but they have user-facing positive externalities. So with MaxEB, just a quick summary here. Essentially, I won't go too deep on this. Essentially, what it wants to do is take a lot of load off the network. And by doing this, we get to basically put more load on the network for other purposes. So for example, if we take load off the network with this MaxEB upgrade, we essentially allow more load to be put on the network for layer 2 scalability, for example. So then it becomes user-facing, where essentially the users on the layer 2s will feel the cheaper fees because of it. So yeah, there is a hybrid bucket as well there, which is really cool. But this is why I said, at the top of the talk, that we're in this golden age of Ethereum scalability, because we have L1 roadmap items that are working on non-user-facing stuff that are going to harden the protocol. But then we've also got a lot that is working for the L2s, which are the user-facing layers, which will improve it there, not just with fees, but also with being able to essentially tap into different primitives on L1 that you may not have been able to tap into before. One of the things that went live with Dencun was that the two layers of Ethereum, the consensus layer and the execution layer, the term layer has been so misused.
So layer 1 has 2 layers?
Yeah, exactly. Like, I knew I was going to maybe confuse people with that, but allowing them to communicate in a better way, allowing them to basically, people to build things based on that new communication that could flow up to L2s as well. So yeah, basically the whole kind of roadmap is in service of hardening the protocol for everyone, not just for the L2s, but then also scaling the protocol for the L2s. And people will ask, what about the L1? Is that going to be scalable in the future? It's never going to be as scalable as L2s. That's just not the way Ethereum has been architected. But once a lot of these upgrades materialize, L1 will be more scalable, but it's not going to be scalable to the point that it can service the world. It's going to be scalable for the L2s, for the big institutional players like BlackRock, which we're going to get into in a sec. So that's kind of what's happening there.
Let's not spend too much time on this, but kind of, if you read between the lines, all this thing is getting us extremely ready for a world where you can have millions of users interact with millions of transactions at any given time and have an experience that doesn't really let them know that they're interacting with the blockchain. How far off do you think the consumer crypto world is? And are you seeing something that you think is already on the verge of actually getting there? And anything kind of on the consumer side that you're excited about?
It's always hard because within crypto, things live or die quite quickly, I think, because of the financial incentives, the monetary incentives. There are certainly non-speculative apps that have taken off recently. I think one of the best examples is Farcaster that has taken off recently. I'm sure a few people in the audience are using Farcaster. But even with Farcaster, as much as I love it, it became quite speculative very quickly because there were like meme coins on there that you could mint in feed. There were like NFTs you could mint in feed. And obviously when there's money, there's people farming the money as well and setting up bots and things like that. So when it comes to the overall consumer side, I think there's going to be a delicate balance between recognizing what's a bot and recognizing what's a real human. And we have a lot of solutions in the works to try and do that without doing KYC. Because obviously everyone will be like, oh, why don't we just do KYC? It's like, well, it defeats the whole purpose of what we're building, of course. Okay, so how do we get around that? And there are a lot of kind of on-chain identity solutions that are being built and being experimented with. Gitcoin's been experimenting with them for a while now. Polygon's doing a bunch of work there as well, I believe. And there's others out there like Bright ID and POAP as well fits into this. So when you look at that and look at the kind of approach we're taking from that lens, that is still very early. So from the consumer app side of things, you can say, oh, my app has millions of users. And it's like, okay, how many are real human users versus how many are bots? Because the vast majority will be bots. And that's fine. Like the vast majority...
For the same problem exists in Web 2 too, except just the ratios are slightly higher on this side.
Yeah. Well, within also with Web 2, when you're doing financial things, you're KYC'd. That's there. And it's also permissioned where they can block your API access. So people always compare Web 3 to Web 2 and say, okay, well, why can't we be more as scalable as the NASDAQ? It's like, well, guys, the NASDAQ is a permission-controlled system that has an API that they only allow access to people that they know. It's not like crypto or Web 3 where we have permissionless access for anyone in the world, including North Korea, as we've seen. You know, they love to hack the protocols. They can access this anytime, anywhere they want globally, and there's no way to stop them because there's no, it's a permissionless system. There's no one shutting them off. I mean, we've seen how there are issues with censorship because you can technically censor them, but to get full censorship is basically impossible on the Ethereum network. So from that lens, yeah, I think when it falls to the consumer app side of things, you have to have a way to balance what's a real user versus what is bots. And I know that protocols like to say they're real users because it pumps up the metrics. Web 2 does this too. I'm sure that Facebook and Instagram and all that, they all do this. But we can see it on chain. They can hide it from us. We can see this on chain.
It just gets expensive at a point where you can try your best,
yes,
but it'll cost you.
Yeah, but then that also introduces the issue of the fact that the cost is a lot to a regular user, but the cost to an MEV bot is not, because they're like, okay, well, even if it costs me $100 to do this transaction, if I make a couple dollars of profit, it's worth my time to do this because I'll do this hundreds of times a day, sort of thing. So there is a delicate balance there that is unique to Web3, I think, because of the financial side of things.
So I guess before we wrap up, let's kind of switch perspectives from what we know on the developer side and the protocol side to what everybody else sees about what's happening in crypto. There's a lot of themes that are getting crypto and just Ethereum even more and more mainstream. And we kind of have been seeing a lot of that in the news recently. So there's talks about, Stripe recently integrated crypto payments back, so you can do that at checkouts, or you'll be able to very soon. We have kind of the ETF stuff going on. We're seeing that happen in multiple countries, and we're seeing obviously people try different sort of payments as a regular thing. Is that cool? Is that good? Or is that just we knew it was going to happen, so I'm glad that they're just trying it? How do you feel about the confidence in this ecosystem from all those participants giving crypto a shot again?
I think from the outside looking in, like a non-crypto native, just like a regular person looking into crypto, traditionally all you've seen is the real speculative kind of gross side, I guess you could call it, because typically these people will only pay attention to crypto at the end of a bull market, or like the tail end of a bull market, where, in 2021 we had NFTs going nuts, and everyone's like, why are these things, like everyone outside of crypto is like, why are these things worth hundreds of thousands of dollars?
There was a point where NFTs were the default profiles for Instagram.
Yes.
As a product that has 1 billion users, and I don't think I've seen that after.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So there was a lot of mania around it due to the monetary incentives, right? But then we also have this weird thing going on right now where we're getting a lot of institutional adoption generally. You mentioned the ETFs, study May 23rd, we'll see what happens with the ETH ETF in the US, but you mentioned the other countries like Hong Kong. Australia recently announced that they're going to be doing a Bitcoin ETF soon. Not sure on the ETH ETF front, but I'm sure that will follow shortly after, well, hopefully. But, it's becoming apparent that the institutions, the bigger players, the TradFi players, as you mentioned, Stripe as well, they're very interested in crypto still. BlackRock just put their own, tokenized fund on Ethereum mainnet, on L1 Ethereum, not a private chain, not some test net, on mainnet with real kind of money on the line there, real capital on the line. So there's a lot of real institutional adoption happening. But the reason why it's weird is because then you have the regulators in the US being very anti-crypto. I don't have to go into the details, we all know, but it kind of becomes this thing of, okay, well, if the biggest TradFi players in the world, like BlackRock and Stripe...
Which manages like $8 trillion or something of assets for the rest of the world.
Exactly. If they're embracing crypto and thinking that this is the future, and Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, is going on mainstream media and saying tokenization is the future, and then you have the other side, whereas the regulators being like, we need to stamp this thing out, it just creates this very weird perception, I think, for the mainstream audience, where they're like, is this thing real? Is it not? Like, why is BlackRock involved with this if Gary Gensler hates Ethereum, sort of thing? So I think that it's shifted from people being grossed out by crypto to maybe being curious but confused now. And that's no fault of our own, I don't think. We can't control what the regulators do. We can't control what the politics are there. But I've always been about, follow the money, follow the developers as well, follow the building. And the building and the developers and the money is all still on-chain is the future. So from that perspective, from that lens, I think that the regulatory, political side of things will get worked out eventually. Either people will move where they're based, based on the hostile environments that they're in the US, for example, or eventually the regulators will just keep losing in the court and keep getting forced into doing things, and it'll be fine eventually. So there's a fight. Don't get me wrong. There is a war. There is a fight, especially on the privacy side.
And a continuous, constant fight.
Exactly. And we're going to have a talk about privacy. Not us, but there will be a talk about the privacy side. The next one coming up. But that is definitely something that I don't know if people have been paying attention to, has been really under the microscope lately from the Department of Justice in the US. They're coming down hard on privacy because they're, as Niraj from Coin Center put it, their warrantless surveillance regime wasn't built for a world where they didn't control the intermediaries. They don't control the intermediaries on chain, and they're really, I don't know if they're scared of it, but they're really concerned because the state is all about control and they're losing it with the privacy. So I'll let the next panel talk about that. But that is a fight that we're going to have for sure.
I think that was a really awesome summary of all the themes that we know will become super relevant in the next 6 to 12 months. And we kind of covered what's happening from the consumer side to the protocol side to just the effects of that for if you're a developer or a person just interacting with crypto. And hopefully you all found that super insightful. I personally did, and I learned a bunch of new things too. So before we kind of end this discussion, my last question to you is, overall, would you say you're bullish on Ethereum?
Well, I woke up bullish today, if that's any indication. But yes, very bullish on Ethereum, very bullish on everything happening within the ecosystem, everything we talked about and didn't talk about. But also, before we end, I just want to say a big thank you for bringing ETH Global to Australia. We're often the forgotten nation in crypto, maybe not as forgotten as New Zealand. Shout out to the Kiwis, but we definitely on the other side of the world. But we have a lot of here, a lot of protocols here, a lot of projects here. Just to name a few: Immutable, we have Rockapool, we have Sigma Prime, developers of the Lighthouse client, Swell. There are so many that are in Australia and that are born out of Australia. I think we're batting above our average for sure. But
Absolutely.
Also, yeah. So thank you once again for bringing ETH Global to Australia.
Well, thank you. When we were looking at where we should go next, it was very obvious that, hey, why is nobody doing events in Australia? It's been 5 years since the last big one. I think it was EdCon was the last one I personally can remember. And I feel like that is injustice. We see so many people participate in our online events. We see so many Australians come to all the other events that we do. And we wouldn't be ETH Global if you don't show up everywhere else. So I'm super happy that we're here, and I can't wait for the next one to be even bigger than this. So Anthony, thank you so much for joining me here, and hope you all enjoyed this discussion.